The sound was wrong. Not the gentle hum of wind through mesquite trees, or the distant lowing of cattle that Caleb Morrison had expected when he bought 300 acres of Texas rangeland. This was mechanical, precise, hovering just above the roofline of his new ranch house every morning at exactly 7:15. The first drone appeared 3 days after he moved in, circling like a metallic vulture against the dawn sky. By the 4th day, there were 2. By the 7th day, 4 drones traced perfect geometric patterns above his property, their cameras trained downward like unblinking eyes. Caleb stood on his front porch, coffee growing cold in his hands, watching machines that had no business being there. Nobody had permission to fly over his land. Caleb had purchased this spread 6 months ago, with money saved from 15 years as a software engineer in Austin. The corporate world had left him exhausted, staring at screens for 12 hours a day, debugging code for companies that treated employees like disposable equipment. The ranch represented everything he craved. Space, quiet, honest work with his hands instead of keyboards. The previous owner, an elderly rancher named Tom Bradshaw, had been eager to sell. Too eager, Caleb now realized. The man had practically shoved the deed across the table, his weathered hands shaking as he signed the papers. The property stretched across rolling hills dotted with live oaks, perfect grazing land for the small herd of cattle Caleb planned to buy. A creek ran through the eastern section, providing natural water sources. The house needed work, new plumbing, updated electrical, fresh paint, but the bones were solid. Caleb had spent his first weeks here in peace, waking before sunrise to walk his land, planning where to build new fencing and repair the old barn. Then the surveillance began. The drones arrived without explanation, without warning. They maintained precise flight patterns, never landing, never approaching close enough for Caleb to identify markings or registration numbers. Each morning brought the same routine, mechanical whirring overhead, cameras recording every movement he made across his property. When he tried to photograph them with his phone, they rose higher, staying just beyond clear focus. Caleb had called the local sheriff's office twice. Deputy Martinez had been polite but unhelpful, suggesting the drones might belong to surveying companies or environmental researchers. When Caleb mentioned he owned the land and hadn't given permission for any aerial monitoring, Martinez had promised to look into it. That was 4 days ago. Standing on his porch now, watching the morning patrol of mechanical intruders, Caleb felt the first real stirrings of unease. Someone wanted to know everything about his daily routines. Someone with expensive equipment and the patience to conduct systematic surveillance. Someone who clearly didn't care about property rights or privacy laws. The question that kept him awake at night was simple but terrifying. What exactly had he bought when he purchased these 300 acres? And what did someone else think was worth watching so carefully? The answer began revealing itself when Caleb drove into town that afternoon. Clearwater was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, where the local diner served as both restaurant and information exchange. Caleb parked his pickup truck outside Martha's Cafe, hoping someone might have noticed unusual aircraft activity in the area. The bell above the door chimed as he entered, and conversation stopped. 6 pairs of eyes turned toward him with expressions he couldn't quite read. Not hostility, but something close to pity. Martha Hendricks, the cafe owner, poured coffee without being asked. Her hands trembled slightly as she set the cup down. "You're the new fellow who bought the Bradshaw place," she said. It wasn't a question. Caleb nodded, settling onto a worn vinyl stool at the counter. "That's right. Been having some interesting visitors lately. Drones flying over my property every morning. Thought maybe someone around here might know who's operating them." The silence stretched uncomfortably long. Finally, an old rancher named Pete Lawson cleared his throat. "Son, you might want to consider selling that land back. Moving somewhere else. Plenty of good ranch property in the county that doesn't come with complications." "What kind of complications?" Caleb asked. But Pete had already turned back to his pie, effectively ending the conversation. Martha leaned closer, lowering her voice. "There's an attorney in town you should talk to. Elena Vasquez has an office above the bank. She knows about property law, especially when it comes to that particular section of land." She wrote an address on a napkin, sliding it across the counter. "Tell her Martha sent you. And Caleb, be careful who you trust around here." 20 minutes later, Caleb climbed narrow stairs to Elena Vasquez's office. The nameplate on her door read, "Vasquez Law, Property Rights, and Environmental Law." He knocked twice before a voice called for him to enter. Elena Vasquez was younger than he'd expected, maybe late 30s, with intelligent dark eyes and graying hair pulled back in a professional bun. Her office walls were covered with maps of the county, some marked with red pins and colored zones. She looked up from a stack of legal documents as Caleb introduced himself. "The Bradshaw property," she said, recognition immediately crossing her features. "I wondered when someone would come to see me about that. Please sit down. We need to talk." She pulled out a thick file folder, spreading several documents across her desk. "Mr. Morrison, when you bought that land, did anyone mention mineral rights, water rights? Any previous legal disputes or pending litigation?" "No," Caleb replied, unease growing in his stomach. "Tom Bradshaw said it was a clean sale. No complications." Elena's expression darkened. "Tom Bradshaw lied to you. That property has been the subject of a legal battle for 2 years. A company called Pinnacle Development Corporation claims they have mineral extraction rights to everything beneath your land. They've been trying to buy out Bradshaw for months, but he refused to sell to them." She pointed to one of the maps, where a large section was outlined in red. "Your 300 acres sits directly over one of the largest lithium deposits in Texas. Pinnacle wants to strip mine the entire area." Caleb felt his world shift beneath him. "But I have the deed. I own that land." "You own the surface rights," Elena corrected grimly. "The question is whether Pinnacle legitimately owns what's underneath, and they're not the kind of company that takes no for an answer." She looked directly at him, her voice dropping to an urgent whisper. "Those drones aren't just watching you, Mr. Morrison. They're building a case to force you out through legal intimidation." The coffee shop conversation suddenly made terrible sense. How long before they make their move? Elena glanced at her calendar, then back at the legal documents. "Based on their previous patterns with other properties, I'd say you have maybe 2 weeks before they file papers claiming agricultural abandonment and seek court-ordered seizure of your land." Outside her office window, Caleb could see his pickup truck parked on Main Street. As he watched, a black sedan with tinted windows pulled up behind it, the driver remaining inside, clearly observing. The surveillance had followed him to town. The game was bigger and more dangerous than he'd imagined. The black sedan followed Caleb for 12 miles on the drive back to his ranch, maintaining exactly the same distance behind his pickup truck. When he deliberately slowed down, the sedan slowed. When he accelerated, it matched his speed perfectly. The driver wore sunglasses and never turned his head, but Caleb could feel the weight of constant observation. As he turned onto his private road, the sedan continued straight down the highway, disappearing around a bend in the direction of the interstate. Back at his ranch house, Caleb found something that made his blood run cold. A manila envelope had been placed on his front porch, weighted down with a smooth river stone. No postmark, no delivery service sticker. Someone had walked right up to his door while he was in town. Inside the envelope were aerial photographs of his property taken from directly overhead, each image time-stamped and dated from the past week. The resolution was professional quality, showing him walking around his land, examining the old barn, checking fence lines. In one photo, he could clearly see himself standing on the porch drinking coffee, looking up at the drones. Attached to the photographs was a business card for Marcus Chen, Senior Land Acquisition Specialist, Pinnacle Development Corporation. On the back, someone had written in precise handwriting, "We should talk. Tomorrow, 2 p.m., your property. Come alone." Caleb studied the aerial images more carefully, using a magnifying glass from his toolbox. The photos revealed details about his land that he hadn't noticed from ground level. There were geometric patterns in the soil near the creek, perfectly straight lines that looked almost like roads or foundations buried just beneath the surface. In several shots, small white markers were visible in areas where he'd never walked, placed in locations that formed a grid pattern across his western pasture. He grabbed his truck keys and drove out to investigate the markers personally. Each one was a small plastic stake with numbers and letters stamped into the surface. The markings meant nothing to him, but their placement was clearly part of a systematic survey. Someone had been conducting detailed geological assessment of his property without permission, probably for months before he even bought the land. As afternoon shadows lengthened, Caleb noticed other troubling details. The fence line on his southern border had been cut and repaired recently, but not by him. The lock on his barn had fresh scratches around the keyhole, suggesting someone had picked it. When he checked inside, nothing appeared missing, but his stored tools had been moved and arranged differently than he'd left them. The most disturbing discovery came when he examined the creek more closely. The water level was lower than it had been when he first toured the property 6 months ago. Following the creek upstream toward his property line, he found a newly installed concrete dam that hadn't existed before. Someone was deliberately diverting water flow away from his land, potentially to claim his water rights were being abandoned. That evening, as the sun set behind the hills, the drones returned for their usual surveillance flight. But this time there were 6 of them, and they weren't just observing. Each drone dropped a small white object before flying away. When Caleb went outside to investigate, he found legal documents scattered across his front yard. All were court filings dated for the following week. Pinnacle Development Corporation was simultaneously suing him for improper land use, water rights violations, and failure to maintain agricultural standards. The papers also included a formal notice that representatives from Pinnacle would be conducting a compliance inspection of his property tomorrow at 2 o'clock, exactly the time Marcus Chen had written on his business card. They weren't requesting permission. They were informing him of what was going to happen, standing in his front yard holding legal papers that could destroy everything he'd worked for. Caleb realized that tomorrow's meeting wasn't going to be a negotiation. It was going to be an ultimatum. Marcus Chen arrived precisely at 2 o'clock, stepping out of a pristine white Suburban with corporate license plates. He wasn't alone. 2 other men in expensive suits followed him across Caleb's front yard, one carrying a briefcase and digital tablet, the other holding what appeared to be soil testing equipment. Chen himself was younger than Caleb had expected, maybe 35, with perfectly groomed hair and shoes that cost more than most people made in a month. His smile was practiced and completely without warmth. "Mr. Morrison," Chen said, extending his hand. "Marcus Chen, Pinnacle Development. Thank you for agreeing to meet with us today." Caleb didn't shake the offered hand. "I didn't agree to anything. You sent me legal papers threatening to take my land." "Threatening?" Chen's eyebrows rose in mock surprise. "We're simply ensuring compliance with Texas agricultural standards. Your property is zoned for livestock grazing, but our aerial surveillance shows no evidence of proper land use. No cattle, no crops, no agricultural activity of any kind. That's a violation of your deed restrictions." The man with the briefcase opened his tablet, swiping through aerial photographs that matched the ones dropped on Caleb's porch the day before. According to county records, this land has been designated for agricultural use for over 40 years. When you purchased the property, you agreed to maintain those standards. Failure to do so within 6 months constitutes abandonment of your deed rights. Caleb felt heat rising in his chest. "I bought this land 3 weeks ago. I've been planning to purchase cattle, but I need time to repair the fencing and prepare proper grazing areas." 3 weeks should have been sufficient, the third man interjected, setting down his soil testing kit. Caleb almost laughed at the absurdity. Anyone who knew cattle understood that 3 weeks was barely enough to inspect fencing, let alone establish proper grazing operations. "We've documented evidence that the previous owner, Tom Bradshaw, had already abandoned agricultural use over 2 years ago. The soil composition shows clear signs of mineral-rich deposits that would be better utilized through proper extraction methods." Chen stepped closer, his voice dropping to a conversational tone that somehow felt more menacing than shouting. "Mr. Morrison, Pinnacle Development is prepared to offer you a fair price for this property. Twice what you paid Tom Bradshaw, plus compensation for any improvements you've made. You can walk away with a significant profit and find suitable ranch land elsewhere. Everyone wins." "And if I refuse?" Caleb asked, though he already knew the answer. "Then we proceed with legal action," Chen replied smoothly. "Agricultural abandonment cases typically take 6 to 8 months to resolve through the courts. During that time, you'll be responsible for legal fees, property taxes, and maintenance costs while being unable to sell or properly develop the land. Most people find that financially unsustainable." The man with the soil kit had been taking samples from various locations around Caleb's yard without asking permission. He held up a small vial of dirt, showing it to Chen with a satisfied nod. Lithium content confirmed at 3,200 parts per million, well above commercial extraction thresholds. Chen's smile widened. "You see, Mr. Morrison, this isn't really about cattle grazing. This land sits above one of the most valuable lithium deposits in North America. Lithium that's desperately needed for electric vehicle batteries, renewable energy storage, national security applications. Keeping it buried under a hobby ranch serves no one's interests." "It serves my interests," Caleb said firmly. "I own this land legally." "Surface rights only," Chen corrected. And only as long as you maintain proper agricultural use. Our company holds mineral extraction rights through a subsurface lease granted by the previous owner 20 years ago. Tom Bradshaw never told you about that, did he? The briefcase man handed Caleb a thick legal document. Subsurface mineral rights lease, filed with the county in 2004. Gives Pinnacle Development exclusive rights to all mineral extraction below 30 feet depth. All perfectly legal and binding on future property owners. Caleb scanned the document, his heart sinking as he recognized Tom Bradshaw's signature on the final page. The old rancher had sold the mineral rights decades ago, keeping that information hidden during their property sale. So what happens now? Caleb asked. Chen glanced at his expensive watch. You have 72 hours to accept our buyout offer. After that, we file agricultural abandonment papers and begin court proceedings for subsurface access. Either way, Mr. Morrison, Pinnacle Development will be extracting lithium from this land within the year. The only question is whether you profit from that or get crushed by it. After the Pinnacle representatives drove away, Caleb sat on his front porch steps, holding the mineral rights document, reading it over and over until the legal language began to make terrible sense. Tom Bradshaw had indeed signed away everything below 30 feet in 2004, accepting a modest payment of $50,000 for mineral rights that were now worth millions. The contract included a clause stating that surface owners must be notified of any mineral extraction activities, but only 30 days before drilling commenced. Pinnacle could force him off his land and begin strip mining with a month's notice. Caleb called Elena Vasquez immediately, reading her the relevant sections of the contract over the phone. Her silence stretched so long he thought the connection had been lost. Elena, are you still there? I'm here, she said finally, her voice tight with controlled anger. Caleb, that document changes everything. If Pinnacle legitimately holds mineral rights, they can force subsurface access through eminent domain proceedings. But there's something about this that doesn't feel right. Tom Bradshaw was sharper than most people gave him credit for. He wouldn't have signed away valuable mineral rights unless he was under serious pressure. What kind of pressure? The kind that makes people desperate enough to take bad deals. I need to research the circumstances around that 2004 lease. Can you come back to town this evening? There are some people I want you to meet. That afternoon, while waiting to drive back to Clearwater, Caleb decided to explore the more remote sections of his property. He'd been focusing on the area around the house and barn, but the aerial photographs had shown markers and disturbances throughout his land. Armed with a GPS unit and the printed aerial images, he set out to find the geometric patterns he'd noticed near the creek. What he discovered made his blood run cold. Hidden in a grove of mesquite trees, almost invisible from any normal vantage point, was a drilling test site. Someone had bored multiple core sample holes, each about 6 inches in diameter and marked with numbered metal tags. Fresh tire tracks led to the site, and scattered around the area were soil sample containers with Pinnacle Development labels. The work looked recent, completed within the last few weeks. They hadn't just been watching his property. They'd been actively extracting samples without permission, conducting geological surveys while he slept. The sophistication of the operation was staggering. GPS coordinates for each sample hole, professional core drilling equipment, systematic mapping of the entire lithium deposit. This wasn't opportunistic mineral exploration. This was a multi-million-dollar extraction project already in advanced planning stages. Caleb photographed everything with his phone, documenting the extent of the unauthorized drilling. As he worked, he noticed something else that made him pause. The core sample holes weren't randomly placed. They formed a perfect grid pattern extending beyond his property lines onto neighboring ranches. Pinnacle had been conducting illegal drilling operations across multiple properties, not just his own. He was photographing the tire tracks when he heard the familiar whirring of drone rotors approaching. 4 aircraft appeared over the tree line, flying in formation directly toward his location. But these weren't the surveillance drones he'd grown accustomed to. These were larger, heavier models equipped with high-resolution cameras and what appeared to be communications equipment. The lead drone hovered 30 feet above him, close enough that he could see a small speaker mounted on its underside. A voice crackled through the speaker, distorted but clearly audible. Mr. Morrison, you are trespassing on an active geological research site. Please leave the area immediately, or security personnel will be dispatched to escort you from the premises. Caleb looked around in disbelief. This is my land, he shouted up at the drone. According to subsurface mineral rights documented with Clearwater County, This area falls under Pinnacle Development jurisdiction for research and extraction purposes. You have 5 minutes to clear the area before we contact local law enforcement. This is completely illegal, Caleb muttered, pulling out his phone to record the interaction. Corporate intimidation was one thing, but using drones to threaten property owners crossed every legal line he could think of. The threat was clear, but what shocked Caleb most was the realization that someone was monitoring the drones in real time, watching him through their cameras, ready to respond immediately to his movements on his own property. The level of surveillance was far beyond anything he'd imagined. They weren't just documenting his activities, they were actively controlling and restricting his access to land he legally owned. As he walked back toward his truck, the drones followed overhead, maintaining constant observation until he reached the main road. Whatever game Pinnacle Development was playing, the rules were changing by the hour, and Caleb was running out of time to understand them. That evening, Elena's office was crowded with people Caleb hadn't expected to see. Pete Lawson, the old rancher from the diner, sat in a folding chair next to Martha Hendricks. 2 other local property owners, a husband and wife named Jim and Sarah Chen, occupied the small couch near the window. All of them looked grim, and all of them had thick folders of documents spread across Elena's desk. "Caleb, meet the Clearwater County Resistance," Elena said with dark humor. "Everyone in this room has been targeted by Pinnacle Development over the past 3 years." Pete Lawson cleared his throat, his weathered hands gripping a coffee mug. "They came after my ranch first. Back in 2022, offered me a fair price. Then when I said no, suddenly my water rights were under investigation. County inspector found violations that hadn't existed the week before. Cost me $30,000 in legal fees just to keep my land." Martha and the Chen family nodded grimly. Similar harassment, blocked access to Martha's cafe, fake environmental claims against the Chen's property. The pattern was always the same across every targeted landowner. "The pattern is always the same," Elena explained, pulling out a large map of the county. "Pinnacle identifies properties over lithium deposits, makes initial offers, then uses legal harassment when owners refuse to sell. Water rights violations, environmental challenges, agricultural abandonment claims, anything they can file to make ownership financially unsustainable." Sarah Chen opened her folder, showing Caleb aerial photographs similar to the ones he'd received. "They surveilled our property for months before making their move. Drones every morning, unmarked vehicles parked on county roads, soil samples taken without permission. When we caught their people trespassing and called the sheriff, suddenly we were under investigation for interfering with legitimate geological research." Elena spread Tom Bradshaw's original mineral rights contract across her desk, pointing to specific clauses. "I've been researching the circumstances around this 2004 agreement. Tom Bradshaw was facing bankruptcy that year. His cattle operation had been hit by drought. His wife needed expensive medical treatment, and he owed significant money to creditors. Pinnacle approached him when he was most vulnerable. But here's what Tom never told them," she continued, her voice rising with excitement. "The mineral rights lease contains a clause requiring active surface use of the property for agricultural purposes. If the surface owner abandons farming or ranching activities, the mineral rights revert back to the surface owner automatically."